few years ago, there was a show that was out. And it was a show that was about a few friends, not a bunch, a few friends in New York City. It's newer than the old Friends show. Don't go there. But this show had characters in it. And their names were Ted and Barney. Ted and Barney. And Barney was, he thought he was Ted's best friend, and he wanted to be Ted's best friend. And Barney was a smooth talker with the girls. Like, he could get a date, no problem. And he knew how to say the right words and all that good stuff. But Ted, on the other hand, he was a little bit more of a romantic. And it was a little harder for Ted to make those kinds of relationships. And so Barney took it upon himself that he was going to help Ted find a relationship. He was going to introduce Ted to his next girlfriend. He was always trying to find Ted's next girlfriend. And so he came up with this plan that when they were walking along, if they came up to a young lady that he wanted to introduce Ted to, he would tap the young lady on the shoulder and say, "Have you met Ted?" And then he would just back away and have Ted just have to figure it out. A lot of times Ted didn't even know it was going to happen. You ever done that to your friend? A really interesting way to introduce girls to Ted. I was thinking about this series that we're going to be doing here over the next few weeks as we enter into the Lenten season. A series where we're going to be talking about Jesus. And I was thinking about how there have been so many things that have been written. There have been so many pastors and preachers who are way smarter than I am who have talked about Jesus. And yet, after all these thousands of years, in this moment, I really sense and feel like it's a moment where I want to tap you on the shoulder. I want to tap the world on the shoulder and say, have you met Jesus? Have you met Jesus? The real Jesus. And so we're going to be studying and going into depth in the book of John, looking at the I am statements of Jesus. The book of John is a little bit different than the other gospels in the New Testament. John writes with a different perspective. His goal really is to help us to understand the why behind Jesus, to get to know Jesus on a much deeper level. And so, we're going to go into this. And I invite you, whether you've been a Christian for 50 years or 2 years, or maybe you're even here and you're not even sure you believe in Jesus like this, to open your heart, to open your mind. And I just love the opportunity just to say, have you met Jesus? The real, authentic Jesus.
Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. You can have all of this world and give me Jesus.
The phrase "I am" that Jesus uses in the book of John, in the Greek, it is pronounced "ago eimi." Ago eimi. The phrase "I am" is found 29 times in the book of John. 26 of them are actually mentioned by Jesus himself. So clearly this phrase has a great deal of importance to it. In particular, the phrase occurs 7 times as a predicate with a noun, right? Jesus says, "I am the bread, the light, the gate, the good shepherd, the resurrection and life, the way, truth, and life, and the vine." When you look at the context of who would have been hearing these statements by Jesus, you got to remember that they were also a very agriculturally driven society. And all of these statements would point toward what they would understand as the sources of their lives, what they needed to survive. It would be language and images that the people would identify in their own setting. And also, you got to remember this, even this phrase, I am, if you go back to the Hebrew scriptures, back in Exodus chapter 3 in the Old Testament, the phrase, I am who I am, is what God gives Moses to describe to the people who he is. So that Moses can tell them that I am who I am sent him. It's in Hebrew. And God is basically saying he is the very source of all life, from the beginning to the end. And really what this is establishing for the people of Israel to hear, and for even the world to know, is that God has the authority. This God is the author of life. And what God does for the people of Israel is he brings them to new life out of slavery and out of darkness. Which brings us to the I am statement we're going to begin with this week. In John chapter 8, we're going to look at one of Jesus' I am statements. But the first part of this chapter in John chapter 8 has the religious leaders of the day trying to trap Jesus. And so they bring a woman who has actually been caught in the act of adultery. They bring her and drag her before Jesus, and a crowd, a mob of men have gathered around it, and they try to set this whole thing up, and they try to figure out what Jesus is going to say. And because this woman, because she was caught in the act of adultery, should have been stoned to death. The law of their land actually provided that she could have been stoned to death for what she had done. Interesting that they bring her and not the man that was in the act, but they bring her. And just like even today, maybe it's on social media, if you get a mob stirred up, you can pull this kind of thing off. But Jesus doesn't fall for their trick. Instead, he turns the light on them and the condition of their hearts. And he has this really famous line in John chapter 8, verse 7. He says, let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. And instantly the mob gets checked, all right? And nobody gets to throw a stone that day. So after this failed attempt at trying to trick Jesus, the scene changes. When we move to the temple, and the scene moves to the temple where there's a festival that has been going on called the Feast of the Tabernacle. It's a celebration of the way that God, like we had just talked about, had brought the people out of Egypt. They celebrate the different aspects of the journey, from the way God provided even water for them to drink while they were there out in the desert, at which Jesus had proclaimed that he offers living water. And even here in this next moment, they are celebrating the light by which God had guided them and protected them. It was said that by day he would guide them with a cloud, and by night with a pillar of fire. It's really quite interesting how they would celebrate this light. See, the temple would be divided up into these different courts, and there would be spaces for men and spaces for women. And during this portion of the festival, they would set up these different candelabras. It was like candelabras with the light on them and the fire on them. And there would be dancers. It would just be this amazing experience for everyone. Probably a scene of national pride and a scene of people who are so thankful for what God had done. An emotional experience as they recount and as they tell stories of their ancestors, of how they had come through the desert and how the light shined in the darkness. And so there would just be so much emotion, and you could sense it building up in everyone who is there. Just an incredible moment. It is in that kind of moment And I can only imagine Jesus, who's there taking it all in, something within him swells up and he says, I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't have to walk in darkness because you will have the light that leads to life. Now, I have no idea how this actually happened, but I'm imagining that when Jesus says that, the music stops. There's a hush that comes over the crowd. And these Pharisees who are standing there, maybe some of them who had just been part of that whole trying to trap Jesus with the woman caught in adultery, they're all standing there, they hear what he says, and of course they're going to try to rebuttal what he says. They're going to try to push back on him because they're committed to arguing and trying to discredit Jesus at every turn. So they clap back at him. It says the Pharisees replied, you are making those claims about yourself. Such testimony is not valid. So Jesus told them, these claims are valid even though I make them about myself. For I know where I came from and where I am going, but you don't know this about me. You judge me by human standards, but I do not judge anyone. And if I did, my judgment would be correct in every respect because I am not alone. The Father who sent me is with me. Your own law says that if two people agree about something, their witness is accepted as fact. I am one witness, and my Father who sent me is the other. Where is your Father? They asked. It's interesting, this claim about the light that Jesus starts off with by saying he is the light of the world. See, Jesus would know. Jesus was real familiar with their story as a Jewish people. Stories that they had learned their entire lives, stories that had been passed down as they came to the temple to learn and listen. They would listen to what the prophets of old had said, and one of those prophets of old was this prophet named Isaiah. Jesus knew what they thought about the light. Jesus knew what the prophets had said about the one who would come. See, the words in Isaiah chapter 42, verse 1, the prophet says, look at my servant whom I strengthen. He is my chosen one who pleases me. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring justice to the nations. Jump down to verse 6. It says, I, the Lord, have called you to demonstrate my righteousness. I will take you by the hand and guard you. I will give you to my people Israel as a symbol of my covenant with them, and you will be a light to guide the nations. You will open the eyes of the blind. You will free the captives from prison, releasing those who sit in a dark dungeon. Jesus wants them to make this connection. And these religious leaders, in this moment, they push back against Jesus. It's a move to discredit Jesus. It's a move to dismiss his claims. It's a move to try and once again try to get Jesus tripped up and try to accuse him of being something that he's not. But Jesus brings it right back to them. Because Jesus knows that they've been stumped too. They recognize that Jesus has done so much good, that he has brought healing to people. And it's kind of hard to say someone is evil who is actually being the opposite of evil. Even one of their own, a Pharisee by the name of Nicodemus, if you were look to back in the book, back to John chapter 3, where Nicodemus, this Pharisee, comes to Jesus under the cover of darkness, and he comes to talk to Jesus. And when he comes to Jesus in chapter 3, verse 2, it says, Rabbi, this is Nicodemus, a Pharisee. We all know that God has sent you to teach us. Your miraculous signs are evidence that God is with you. That's a Pharisee, right? So when Jesus comes back at them, pointing out that the other witness he needs is God the Father, he's not bringing this out of nowhere. Even the Pharisees have obviously been talking about this. There's been discussion. Even some of their own leaders are believing that it is God who is at work in and through Jesus. But this set of leaders, Jesus knows that this argument isn't going to go very far with them. Have you ever tried to convince somebody who already has their mind made up about something, right? Jesus sees right through their fluff. They're so empty. And Jesus describes it. He describes it's time. He's decided it's time to call them on their garbage. Basically, he ends up telling them, you are blind because you really don't know the God you claim to worship. Because if they had been following the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, if they had actually been living by the words that had been passed down, if they had actually loved God with everything in them and loved their neighbor as much as they loved themselves, they would have recognized, or at least they would have been receptive to the possibility of who Jesus was. Here was someone who wasn't using violence. Here was someone who was caring for those on the margins. Here was someone who was literally embodying everything that they would have learned and heard about. Here was someone who was showing and leading by serving. But they didn't like it. They didn't like it because it uncovered their motives. Instead, they were comfortable with their spiritual blindness. And they didn't appreciate the light that Jesus was bringing. So the next several verses after this, the debate only intensifies between Jesus and these religious leaders, to the point where Jesus even flat out tells them that their father is the devil. And they had this back and forth about being descendants of Abraham, and as if their religion is what will save them. And Jesus says, yes, you are descendants, but you are not his children. Listen to how this goes down in the next part of this. John 8:42 through 47. He says, if God were your father, you would love me, because I have come to you from God. I'm not here on my own, but he sent me. Why can't you understand what I am saying? It's because you can't even hear me. For you are the children of your father, the devil, and you love to do the evil things he does. He was a murderer from the beginning. He has always hated the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, it is consistent with his character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So when I tell you the truth, you just naturally don't believe me. Which of you can truthfully accuse me of sin? And since I am telling you the truth, why don't you believe me? Anyone who belongs to God listens gladly to the words of God. But you don't listen because you don't belong to God. As you can imagine, this does not go over very well with these religious leaders. In this exchange, Jesus makes it pretty clear. Religion can't save you. You can go to church all the time. You can read the Bible and claim it's God's word. You can think you are some kind of a Christian defender. But all of that stuff, if it is not helping you to have the heart of Jesus, if it does not help you to love God with everything in you, to love your neighbor as yourself, you may not actually know the God you're studying about. See, the light that Jesus is a light that reveals truth. The light reveals that Jesus is God. Everything about who God is, what God cares about, how much God loves us is found in Jesus. Everything about who we are to be is found in Jesus. Our purpose, our life direction can be found in Jesus because Jesus is who God created us to be like. I'm going to say that one more time. I didn't make that a graphic, but I like it a lot. Jesus is who God created us to be like. But these religious leaders, they refuse to see it. In fact, chapter 8 ends where they are ready to stone Jesus, right? They hate him so much. But Jesus slips away before it can all go down. It's not time for that. The reality is the religious leaders take their anger out on the people, which is another indication of where their heart is. And as chapter 9 begins in the book of John, we see this on full display in the story of how Jesus heals a man who had been blind. See, Jesus and his disciples they're walking along and they see a man who had been blind since he was born. And they ask him, was he born this way because his parents sinned? And Jesus is like, no. It's not because of his parents' sin. Here's what he says in chapter 9, verse 3. He says, this happened so the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the task assigned to us by the one who sent us. The night is coming and then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. In other words, Jesus sees a really good opportunity here with this man who has been born blind to show them, and obviously the world, what he meant when he says he is the light of the world. See, the light reveals the truth about our need for God's work in our lives. So Jesus takes some dirt and spits in it and rubs it in the guy's eyes. Strange, but it happens. And suddenly the man can see. And can you imagine what that would have been like for him? All of his life has been lived in darkness, right? I was thinking about that, like, how would he even know what to imagine he could see, right? Like, he was born that way. He couldn't see. So he didn't know what a tree looked like. He didn't know the colors of the flowers. He didn't know any of that. I don't know what he would have imagined, right? Because he lived in so much darkness. But now the light was bursting through. The other night, I had to get up to get some medicine. It was like 1:30 in the morning. I'd only been asleep for a little while, so I was just starting to get into that really nice. I'm stumbling through the darkness and I'm making my way to the bathroom and I had this idea that if I could just turn the light on for just a few seconds, maybe I could still keep that sleepiness, right? So I flip it on and I try to get to the medicine, and as I get closer to it, I realize I can't read it very well. So I had to allow myself to wake up some more, but it was hard to focus my eyes because the light was so bright. After being asleep and eyes closed and in the dark. There was probably, for this man who finally could see, there was probably even a moment of discomfort, right? Not to mention the fact he had spit and mud in his eyes. But once he washed that away, for the first time to experience the sunlight. But the discomfort soon gives way to the truth. The truth was that he can finally see. And it has an impact on his neighborhood, right? People are looking at him. Is this really the guy we always have seen? What in the world happened to him? And they bring him to the religious leaders, and they're trying to figure this out. And the religious leaders are trying to figure out how he could have been healed. And they interrogate him over and over again, and they treat him so bad. And he says it was this Jesus guy who did it for him. Man, that really ticks him off. They're so sure about their stance on Jesus. Here's what they even said, he must not have been able to see. He must have never really been blind in the first place. Right? Sheesh. It says in verse 24, so for the second time, they called in the man who had been blind and told him, God should get the glory for this because we know this man Jesus is a sinner. I love his line. I don't know whether he is a sinner, the man replied. But I know this. I was blind and now I can see. And they go back and forth, and they finally had enough, and they kicked the man out of church. They didn't want to hear any more of it. They didn't want him spreading this stuff about what Jesus could do. They cut him off from the community. So much for that loving your neighbor thing they were supposed to be doing, right? But guess who sees this and goes down, who comes and finds this man? It says in verse 27, when Jesus heard, in verse 35, when Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. You have seen him, Jesus said, and he is speaking to you. Yes, Lord, I believe, the man said. And he worshiped Jesus. Then Jesus told him, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, and to show those who think they see that they are blind. And some Pharisees who were standing nearby heard him and asked, are you saying we are blind? If you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty, Jesus replied. But you remain guilty because you claim you can see. The light reveals we may not know as much as we think we do. So what do we do? What do we do when religion takes us down places like these Pharisees? When we begin to see people as problems instead of those who God created. What happens when we struggle to know what is right and what is wrong? Have you met Jesus? It comes back to Jesus because he is the light of the world who reveals the truth about who we are, the truth about who God is, and the truth about who we can become because of what Jesus has done for us. Let's stand together. Would you bow your heads? I don't know where you see yourself in this story today. Maybe you haven't given Jesus your life. Today is your day. Today is the day to accept him, and you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to have everything lined up. Here was this man who was healed of his blindness. He didn't have it all figured out. But Jesus came and found him. And today Jesus is running for you. He's reaching for you. He's calling you. Maybe today your heart is growing a little cold. Some areas that in your life that you've tried to hide. Let the light in. Let the light in to restore, renew. Have you met Jesus today?